I'm here tonight to give more of a general overview, rather than talk about the research and our findings specifically, a general overview of what we know about human trafficking. And Father Peter asked me to refer to both labor and sex trafficking, and I can tell you that both of those exist in San Diego at a significant scale. Human trafficking, I will argue tonight, and I will give you good evidence that it is, most people think about it happening internationally, in Cambodia or in the Philippines or in places like Thailand, where it is very overt and in the public and it's on the news regularly. It is definitely happening there. But most San Diegans have until recently not been very aware that it is a significant social problem here in our neighborhoods. Furthermore, many San Diegans, when they hear that it is here, will assume first and foremost that it is because we're a border town, and it somehow has to do with trafficking that happens across the border into our neighborhoods. And I'm here to tell you tonight that, at least from our most recent research, that a good deal, the highest percentage of those that come into contact with law enforcement and social service agencies, for example, are domestically trafficked. They are domestic, they are citizens of the U.S., they have been trafficked by other citizens of the United States. Human trafficking is an act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing access, or obtaining a person, another person, for the purposes of labor, exploitation, or sex exploitation, sexual exploitation. The Holy Father uses the language of modern slavery. Modern slavery is more appropriate, I think, a broader terminology, but more appropriate terminology for what we're talking about, because the bonds are more often psychological. They are more often because of manipulated relationships, force, fraud, coercion, that is not necessarily formal chains, somebody being locked up somewhere, right? Threats to family, threats to somebody's safety, somebody's papers, documents being held in ransom for somebody's work and somebody's sexual pleasure. And then in California, in the United States, any commercial sexual act that happens with somebody who is younger than 18 is automatically calculated as a human trafficking act. Globally, we're looking at a problem that is probably 21 million victims of forced labor and something to the tune of 4.5 million of victims who are caught up in sex trafficking. Those ratios are important here globally. What does that mean? That means labor trafficking is by far a larger phenomenon, but sex trafficking gets a lot of the attention and the resources poured into it. The industries that found labor trafficking most in, stereotypically people think agriculture, which was third or fourth down the list. Construction and the hospitality industry, restaurants and hotels, were the top industries in which we found evidence of labor trafficking in San Diego County. All racial groups. We found traffickers from black, white, Hispanic, and some evidence, although we had an undercount of interviews from Asian gangs, we found gang members from across the racial spectrum involved. We found victims from across the racial spectrum. We particularly did these focus groups at schools because we had heard anecdotally that recruiting was happening at our area schools. We needed to know what people knew, what the staff at these schools, did they know of recruiting, and how widespread is this? In the 20 schools that we were able to do focus groups in, 140 staff members across those 20 schools, every single of those 20 schools had evidence of recruiting going on near or with students from their schools. 18 out of the 20, so 90% of those schools, had actual documented cases of sex trafficking at their schools. And these are schools that were in North County, Central, East, and South County. We have data on 700 people arrested for prostitution. We think 300 of those, roughly, or about 42% of those arrested for prostitution, are also victims of sex trafficking because, a couple of reasons, they were either underage when they were at their first time of recruitment, or force, fraud, and coercion was involved in their case. This data on 300 sex trafficking survivors led us to see that it is children, led us to see that the average age of recruitment is, for sex trafficking victims in San Diego, is between 14 and a half and 15 and a half. So one of the most vulnerable peoples is a 14-year-old young woman in our schools. And people who are already marginalized, so lower income neighborhoods, lower income families, kids who don't have adults supervising them on a regular basis, runaways, homeless, foster care kids are the most vulnerable. There are certain racial groups that are more vulnerable than others, even though there's evidence in terms of sex trafficking, even though that there is evidence that it crosses all populations. Kids who are already vulnerable are even more vulnerable to this particular crime. The law enforcement. What is law enforcement doing about this? Where is their role in all of this? 9 months ago now, San Diego created its first all law enforcement task force. 19 agencies have gathered together. There is a what's called the San Diego County Advisory Council on Human Trafficking and the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children, in which agencies, nonprofit agencies, law enforcement, the schools, the probation, the court system, the child welfare system, all gather, leaders from all those areas gather, researchers like myself gather to discern what the current state of trafficking is in San Diego and what the county and all of its services can do about it. How do we understand the demand? Who are the buyers throughout the county, right? What we're finding is buyers, as I said, there's a few things we know, that racially and by class or by their income levels and jobs, they're white collar, they're blue collar, they're all over the racial map, those who are buyers. And for an $810 million a year industry, there's got to be a lot of them. This is an area that needs a lot of attention, and probably congregations can help out with more than any other aspect here, is how do we reduce the demand?